In this session, I'm going to talk about Nissim Ezekiel. He, like A.K. Ramanujan and R. Parthasarathi, is one of the better known Indian English poets. Probably Ezekiel is the senior most of these three. He passed away a few years ago. After a very long struggle, he had Alzheimer's. There is what is called an authentic biography of Nissim Ezekiel by R. Raj Rao. Raj Rao is a professor of English at the University of Pune, and he has written this wonderful biography which I think gives us an insight into the very complex, very imperfect and very turbulent life of Nissim Ezekiel. Ezekiel is well known for many things, but I'd like to concentrate on one or two aspects of his craft. One is his wry sense of humor, a kind of less deceived tone. He's not given to romantic outbursts or lyrical outbursts, and he tries to tone down the enthusiasm. Remember when Shelley sent a poem to Keats, Keats wrote back to Shelley saying, Percy, curb thy enthusiasm and load every rift with ore. A poem has to be beautifully constructed. It's finally an art product. It's both a thing said and a thing made, but it's a thing made. You have to make it. It's like a piece of architecture where every word is in place, where every phrase is thought out. Nothing is adventitious or by accident in a poem. Everything is there because of a certain purpose. So that's what Keats really meant when he spoke to Shelley in those terms, affectionately. But Shelley, of course, was a blithe spirit, and he was not going to be curbed by anybody. Ezekiel curbs himself. But his life was not a curbing at all. In fact, his very tragic life. And he had so many relationships which came to grief, and so many people who have very bitter memories of the man. But be that as it may, there is a difference between the man who suffers and the poet who creates. And Nissim Ezekiel is a man who suffered, but also a poet who created. And I want to concentrate on the creativity of Nissim Ezekiel. The second point I want to make is that Ezekiel uses the English language with great grace. And this is the same poet who could make fun of Indians speaking English, like the goodbye party to Miss Pushpa T.S. I don't have the text with me here, but I have heard Ezekiel himself reading it, and it is so amusing and so funny. At the same time, very serious. It's not as though he's making fun of Indians speaking English in that way. There's also a moral judgment embedded in the poem about people who laugh at people. All right? So he's a deeply moral poet. And I think that's the second point I want to make, that here is a poet who uses the language well, but who also uses it because he also believes in some values. So Two Images is a poem of that kind. It's kind of an imagist poem, and two images are given to us. And each image reflects on the other, comments on the other, and creates a world of significance. So here is just two images. From the long, dark tunnel of that afternoon, crouching, humped, waiting for the promised land, I peeped out like a startled animal and saw a friend flapping his angelic wings. I welcomed him. Fish soul in that silent pool, I found myself supported by the element I lived in, but dragged out with the greatest ease by any fluttering fly at the end of a hook. So two images, clearly part one, part two, two images, one image in each part. In the first part, he seems to be like a startled animal who is trapped and who wants to come out of that tunnel and get the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. and he sees a friend of his looking for him and then seeking him out. And he looks at the friend and thinks that the friend is an angel with wings, angelic wings, and I welcomed him. In the second part, we have a protagonist who looks like a fish in water, struggling, obviously blithe in its movements, but it's a silent pool, and he finds that he's supported, the fish is supported by the water, the element in which it lives. So he's like a fish in water, not a fish out of water, all right? That's the beautiful part of it. The fish in water is supported by the element in which it lives. I am in this world quite comfortable and quite settled. That seems to be the point he's making. But then he's also capable of being disrupted. His life can be disrupted. He can be dragged out like a fish can be dragged out of the element by the fluttering fly at the end of a hook, isn't it? So from the long dark tunnel of that afternoon, look at the number of words which are used here: crouching, humped, waiting for the promised land. Now, why would Nissim Ezekiel use the term promised land? Would Indians normally talk of the promised land? We don't normally talk of it. Hindu writers perhaps are not likely to talk about a promised land. Muslim writers may not talk about a promised land, but some writers do. And what do you think is the significance of the promised land here? Yeah.
It's that Nizam Ezekiel was a Jew, so
Yes.
he shared this belief the
Yes.
Jews had.
Yes.
In the Old Testament, they say that Moses took the people of Israel
Quite right.
to a promised land where there was no misery
Absolutely.
and where everyone was happy.
Absolutely.
So the Jews were also waiting for their Messiah to come. So it's like the Jews' belief coming in this poem, where Nizam Ezekiel is waiting for his Messiah to come.
Yeah, and the Messiah comes in the form of a friend with
Yeah,
angelic wings,
with
and I
angelic
welcomed
wings.
him,
Yeah.
right? Thank you very much, wonderful. From the long dark tunnel of that afternoon, and it's a dark tunnel in an afternoon. The tunnel is dark, the afternoon obviously is bright, okay? Look at the contrasts. From the long dark tunnel of that afternoon, crouching, because you're inside a tunnel, you're crouching, humped obviously, with your shoulders down like that, waiting in expectation for the promised land. But look at the word promised land for the end of the tunnel, you know. It seems to be a huge meaning given to an ordinary experience of wanting to simply come out of this tunnel and get into the bright lights outside. I peeped out like a startled animal. I saw a friend flapping his angelic wings. I welcomed him. One of the things you can see in this Ezekiel poem is that he seems to be converting human beings into either animals or beasts or insects or whatever. There is some kind of a non-human dimension to human beings, right? Am I right in saying that? Do you think it's an exaggerated remark I'm making about this? From the long dark tunnel of that afternoon, crouching, humped, waiting for the promised land, I peeped out like a startled animal. You see, there are many poets, and I can think of a poet like Robert Bly, American poet, or I can think of a poet like William Stafford. And there are a number of poets in the deep imagist school of America, or the Blue Mountain School of Poets, or Ted Hughes in England. People who think that because human beings have made a mess of their lives, maybe they should learn something from the non-human world. So crows, otters, pikes, and foxes might be able to tell you something about life which human beings can't. And so this desire to go into the non-human in order to make ourselves more human seems to be a pattern in modern poetry. I suspect that Ezekiel, who knew his English poetry very well, certainly he knew the English poets like Philip Larkin and Ted Hughes, on whom he has also written. And I think some of that seems to be, in a way, relevant for understanding some of these animal images which seem to be coming up again and again. After all, the angelic friend comes with flapping his wings, like a bird. Angels, of course, have wings, but then to say flapping his wings is a kind of way of making the friend also look non-human. I peeped out like a startled animal and saw a friend flapping his angelic wings. I welcomed him. So this is the first image, and it's a very strong visual impact which you have, where you see a poet who's talking about being a startled animal trying to come out of a trap. Then you have another image which is like a cinematic image changing from one to the other. It's almost cinematic in its technique, isn't it? The cinema is very important in modern culture, as we all know, and it's had over 100 years history now. And the way in which cinema has progressed has also been a fascinating subject for literary people. Many people have used cinematic methods in their narration. The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot is full of cinematic images. And you have one image followed by another, constantly interacting with one another, interconnecting with one another to produce a larger significance. So I think Ezekiel has also learned from the cinema the manner in which images can be used, cinematic images can be put together, collated, a collage, and then create a kind of a meaning. The second part talks of the protagonist not as a bird now, not as a startled animal, but as a fish in water, comfortable in the elements. Like most human beings seem to be reasonably comfortable in the world they live in, but there is always danger lurking, and there is no certainty about our lives. That seems to be Ezekiel's meaning or suggestion. Do you have something to say?
Can the two images be life and death?
Life and death.
The first image is about life and the second image can be death.
It is tempting to have a larger meaning like that.
Okay.
It's tempting. I'm not saying one should ignore it, but a dimension like that can be used. But it can be framing. It can be a framing device in which you savor the manner of arriving at that larger meaning. All right? I am not sure that I would entirely agree with you there, though. Okay? Fish soul. In the silent pool, I found myself supported by the element I lived in, but dragged out with the greatest ease. Just as a fish can be dragged out without any difficulty by somebody who's fishing, all he has to do is put a bait, a fluttering fly, at the end of a hook, and then you capture the fish. Or you put a net, and then you have a huge haul of fish for the day. Which means that human beings are all the time in a state of some kind of insecurity. And whether it is a startled animal trying to come out of the tunnel or a fish coming out of the water, the net result seems to be a lack of stability in our lives. Is that an exaggerated meaning, do you think? I find you're very skeptical about it. Maybe the life and death point which you're making needs to be considered a little more. Would anyone like to comment on that? Any ideas about it? Would you like to elaborate a bit on this?
I just thought that here the friend comes to give him back his life.
Yes.
And in the next image, I think
Take
it's
away
still
the life.
take
virtually.
away life.
I think you have a point. You have a point. But I'm not certain about myself in this matter. And I think that's part of the beauty of reading poetry, that we can't possibly agree on an interpretation. One of the dangers, though, which we must be cautious about, is to come up with too much of a conceptual framework for a poem. It's very easy to say that a poem has this kind of a framework. That stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Everybody talks about the horse which gives its head a little shake and asking whether there's a mistake and so on. Oh, this is God cautioning the poet against forgetting his duty to the world and forgetting his duty to himself. He should not be stopping and staring at the woods because he has promises to keep, miles to go before he can sleep and so on. The horse is conscience. All right? The red wheelbarrow, it's some agrarian allegory. I think this kind of large scale lifting of the significance of a poem, while it may be true in some cases, cannot automatically be applied to many of the modern poets. And if I know something about Ezekiel, I think Ezekiel would be a little wary of allowing himself to be put into or appropriated into what we might call an easy framework of allegory. So I accept your point, but with some reservations. Okay? Let's move on to the next poem. That is called After Reading a Prediction. I think it's a long poem. I think what we should do is read, three people will read three parts of it. So may I ask you, Bhamati, to read the first part.
I'm not superstitious. The zodiac predicts a new creative phase of 7 years for Sagittarians. I remind myself that to be the healer, not the sick or the indifferent one, was always my ambition, and to rage against the barren, not only in friend or stranger, but perfectly familiar in my own signature.
Good.
This is the place where I was born. I know it well. It is home, which I recognize at last as a kind of hell to be made tolerable. Let the fevers come, the patterns break and form again, for me and for the place. I say to it and to myself, not to be dead or dying is a cause for celebration.
Isn't that terrible, that statement? Right, carry on.
Watching spiders climb the commonplace, ants cooperate, lakes reflect the hills of some remembered holiday, ships and swans engender legends, morals, music. I seek on firmer ground to improvise my later fiction, the fallen world, a faithful friend. I also learn to make light of the process, to be the bird in balance on the turbulent air, and yet as present here as any solid human body, heavy, slow, and wishbone, breakable, straining to stay young.
Good. Three parts, clearly. And the first part is about being superstitious or not being superstitious, and some predictions. Second part is a vicious, almost hard-hitting attack on the idea of home. And the third is about becoming at one with the world, accepting the world for what it is. I think there seems to be some sense of positive energy there, but we'll come back to that point. But before we do this, can you just tell me whether in the last but one line, the word wishbone makes any sense to you? Do you know what a wishbone is?
A particular part of the chicken leg, children crack it.
Okay.
It's an age-long, almost a tradition by now. Children crack it, and they believe that if you wish and make a wish before cracking it, the wish is supposed to come true.
Wonderful. And in the dictionary, which I